The Code of Federal Regulations for Placements begins at 34 CFR section 300.115, and it starts with a continuum of alternate placements like we talked. There must be a continuum offered, and a continuum means several different places. Alternative placements must be considered when placing your child. And down here in section B, it talks about things that should be considered: regular classes, special schools, home instruction, instruction in hospitals and institutions if necessary. And it also talks about the use of supplementary aids and services if necessary to help keep your child in the least restrictive environment, that is, in the regular classroom as much as possible. Section 300.116 talks about how placement decisions are made. They're by a group of people who are knowledgeable about the child. If this sounds familiar, it's just like an IEP meeting. Somebody who knows the meaning of the evaluation data, and then put forth several placement options for this group to make a decision on placement. When considering placement, it needs to be determined at least annually. It's based on the child's IEP, and that's generally why the IEP team makes the decision on where the placement will be. It's supposed to be as close to the child's home as possible, and this talks more about the services should be provided in the school that the child would normally attend. But even though there's this wording here and here talking about the home school, there's also a line of cases out there that says that school districts, for fiscal reasons, for money reasons, can join all their services for a given disability in one building as long as it's not too much of a hardship upon parents. So they may have a vision or a hearing program, and that may be in one school, and it may not be your child's home school. The courts have generally said that's okay. With that being said, down here in section E, the child should not be removed from an age-appropriate regular classroom solely because of modifications to the general curriculum. So they still should be educated with their peers, even if it's not in the home school. The school must also ensure that your child has access to non-academic settings. And all this is an assurance that your child can participate in extracurricular services and activities to the maximum extent appropriate. What are those non-academic services? Well, section 300.107 describes them as athletics, counseling, transportation, health services, recreational activities, special interest groups, clubs, anything that's sponsored by the public agency. So when you're in the IEP team meeting and you're deciding upon placement, don't forget that your child's entitled to non-academic activities also, and you want to discuss that in the IEP meeting when you're discussing placement. Extracurricular activities include access for your child to physical education. Generally, if they're made available to every child, then they must be made available to your child. Your child should be in regular physical education as much as possible. If that's not possible, then the physical education should be specially designed by the IEP team on what that would look like and where that placement would be. If other children can attend other areas of study, then that has to be offered to children with disabilities also. So your child should have access, if every other child has access, to art, music, industrial arts, consumer, homemaking education, and vocational education. Once again, whether this is an appropriate placement is generally determined by the IEP team. Your child may not want to be in a voc rehab situation when there's some safety concerns, as an example. The next sections talk about children who are not in the public school. If they're an institution, then services must be provided through an agreement with the private institution or public institution. If it's a residential placement, once again, if the school can't serve the child in the public school, that their needs are too great, then they're placed residentially to improve services, which would be an appropriate placement. It also must be at no cost to the parents of the child. And if the child is placed by the state in a private school or facility, then the state is to ensure that, or if the school places them in a private school or public agency, then the state's responsible for ensuring that the child receives FAPE, free appropriate public education, which means that services are delivered in conformance with the IEP at no cost to the parents, and that it meets state educational standards. The only difference being here from FAPE is it wouldn't be a public education, so it'd be free, it'd be appropriate, and it'd be an education that meets state standards but not public. Section 300.129 through 300.132 talks about the responsibility of the state when parents go ahead and privately place their children. If your child attends a private school and they've been placed there by you, then you might want to read through this as to what services you're entitled to. You'll probably have to talk to your school to figure out exactly how they fund that. They get a portion of funding for private schools, but they can use it in different ways, and each school district does it differently. Section 300.148 talks about the placement of children by parents when a FAPE is at issue. That is, the parents disagree with the placement and feel that their child cannot learn in the placement that they're in, so they voluntarily remove their child from the public school to a private placement in order to receive a free appropriate public education. Now, all that this section of the federal regulations does is it lists what's happened in some court cases, and essentially if a parent pulls a child out of a public school and puts them into a private school, if the court determines that the public school was offering a free appropriate public education, then the parents aren't entitled to any reimbursement. If the court determines that the school was not offering a free appropriate public education, then from the time the parents remove the child and place them in a private placement, parents are entitled to reimbursement for that amount of money they spent on that. If you run into this issue, you may want to talk to an advocate or call Legal Aid of Nebraska. And that is the Code of Federal Regulations on Placement.